They have plundered the world, stripping naked the land in their hunger. They are driven by greed, and if their enemy be rich by ambition, if poor they ravage, they slaughter, they seize by false pretenses, and all of this they hail as the construction of empire. And when in their wake nothing remains but a desert, they call it peace. Crassus was marching eastward into what we now call Asia Minor, a region of what is now southern Turkey. Along the way, he looted towns, temples, and villages, and as a result, increasing his already vast personal wealth, which estimates say in today's dollars could have been the equivalent of up to 20 billion. His greed, truly insatiable. He had left behind 7,000 cavalry and 1,000 infantry to garrison the larger of the towns he'd captured, and then headed back to Syria to winter and wait for his son Publius, who would arrive with Gallic cavalry. Not counting the forces he had garrisoned, his and his son's forces amounted to the following: 28,000 infantry, 4,000 light infantry, 1,000 Gallic cavalry, 3,000 Roman cavalry, and 6,000 Arab cavalry. The Arab cavalry, however, would depart before the battle. As Crassus continued to wait near the end of winter, Parthian envoys inquired about Rome's purpose, and they demanded that Crassus withdraw his troops and not re-enter Parthian territory. Crassus countered with the somewhat false pretense of his stay being official, and the envoys left, likely already fully aware of his intentions given the sacking and looting he had done before the winter. In Part 4, Crassus had turned down the Armenian advice and offer for assistance, and he marched eastward with Surena, the Parthian general, on his tail. The Parthian king Euphrates II, who had defeated the Armenians previously, was making his way to ensure they did not join Crassus, and the plan was to then rejoin with General Surena. As Crassus marched ever deeper, fractures were already beginning to form, even before the Parthians made their first contact. The Gallic cavalry was not used to the hot weather, and despite being mounted, was already beginning to exhaust. General Surena was scouting and surveying his moves, and was early on not noticed by the Romans, but eventually they realized his presence. At first, Crassus had the legions in 48 cohorts in a long, stretching, typical marching line, but eventually, realizing his flanks would be vulnerable, had them tighten into a massive square, and he placed 5,700 infantry on each side of this square. Everyone and everything else was placed into the hollow, in the middle, which included the cavalry, light infantry, baggage train, and even the unarmed camp followers and assistants. Plutarch writes of Crassus in that moment as being altogether frightened out of his senses. Unlike the Celts and many other European tribes who used horns and wind instruments in battle, the Parthians, according to Plutarch, the sound of the Parthians on the battlefield confounded one's soul. For the Parthians do not incite themselves to battle with horns or trumpets, but they have hollow drums of distended hide covered with bronze bells, and on these they beat all at once in many quarters, and the instruments give forth a low and dismal tone. As the Roman square formed, the Parthian drums of war began to beat, slowly at first, and then rising into an ominous wall of sound, coming at the Romans from all directions. Here in the parched dry land, far from their wooded lands or rolling grasslands, only openness. Openness that was still empty all around, yet that sound, the terrible sounds. Surena had a much smaller army, as his original intention was to but harass and attempt to cut off Crassus' supply line while waiting for his king to join him. With him, 1,000 camel cataphracts, Parthian soldiers on camelback with long Parthian spears that were much larger and had far deeper penetrating power than the Roman ones. He also had 9,000 horse archers, in total a force of maybe 1/3 the size of that of Crassus. Seeing an opportunity, though, spread out before him in a massive square, he sent in the first waves of the attack to but probe the Romans and test out his theory. In the horse archers charged, but not right to the Roman heavy infantry, making up that outer wall. Instead, they turned and charged alongside the square walls in parallel and let loose their arrows in continuous volleys. The arrows that passed the Roman shields sank deep into the infantry, fracturing armor and tearing their way through every covering alike, hard or soft. Crassus ordered his light-armed troops that had been witness to that initial carnage from within the hollow of the square to charge. The charge lasted but seconds, as volleys of arrows tore through those men in even more terrible ways. Running back towards the shelter of the inner square, even more terrified and disheartened than when they had left, they brought with them the poisonous seed of lowering morale, which now began to ebb from the front line into the inner square. Crassus and his leadership likely may have thought they could ride out the arrows, that somehow the supply was exhaustible, and with that exhaustion, reprieve from the onslaught still coming at them in waves, taking dozens of men each time a charge of hooves thundered by. Almost as if predicting the question of arrow supply, General Surena allowed just enough camels to be visible to the Romans, and they were heaped with supplies of arrows. The Parthians, still riding in waves, now visibly seen by the Romans to be reloading from these very supply camels. What the Romans were not yet aware of, though, was the ability that made the Parthian archers so much more fearsome. The ability to send volleys of arrows not just sideways or at a full frontal gallop charge, but backwards as they rode away at top speed. The Romans would soon discover this, and it would be a heavy price to pay for Crassus in particular. He was growing weary and now aware of the inexhaustible arrow supply, and he ordered his son Publius to lead the Gallic cavalry, who were by now suffering heavily from the hot weather, along with 300 more cavalry, 500 foot archers, and 8 cohorts to charge the next wave of archers that came at them. And so Publius charged as the next wave attacked and turned back towards their supply train. Publius may have thought this was a turning point. Finally, after inaction, he was leading the charge. However, the Parthians would unleash their ace weapon. As they continued in feigned retreat, they suddenly turned in their saddles and pulled back on their bowstrings till they were taut to cheek. These were not the bowstrings of the Europeans, who still used animal sinew. These were bowstrings made of plaited horsehair, often twisted with ox gut. They were fastened to the Parthian bow, which was a piece of highly elastic wood tipped with metal and bent slightly upwards to better hold the string and deal additional carnage. One can only surmise the horror Publius and the men soon found themselves in, as they were now quite a distance away from the square as the arrows once again tore into Roman and now Gallic flesh. The Parthians eased their gallop into a canter, before stopping as the Romans had begun to rout. The Parthians turned back, launching more arrows at the Romans as they quickly caught up with them and encircled them. The Gallic cavalry had shorter spears, which were ineffective against the Parthian cataphract armor. The Gallic cavalry, though, with their lighter armor, was able to dismount and use a tactic they had heard, and possibly some seen, against Caesar in Gallia by the Germanic tribes. They grabbed hold of the Parthian spears and wrestled them off their steeds, while other Gauls used their spears to kill the Parthian horses. Publius, though, had been shot by an arrow in his right hand, and so, when the opportunity presented, they remounted and carried their leader off to a dune where they put up a shield wall. He was persuaded by some men to escape, but instead released all from his charge to flee and save their own lives. He was then said to have reasoned that no death could scare him enough to retreat, and had a fellow soldier kill him. What was left of the Gallic cavalry fought bravely to try and avenge Publius's death. Cassius Dio would write that though they accomplished nothing worthy of themselves because of the enemy's numbers and tactics. And of the 5,500 Romans, 500 were captured by the Parthians, with one selected to take Publius's head back on a pike to Crassus. General Surena had inquired of the survivors about Publius's family, he and the other Parthians finding it strange how Crassus could be the father of such a warrior who displayed valor and nobility. Despite these, they gave Crassus the opportunity to grieve his son that evening. It has been surmised this may also have been that they feared the Romans had forces of cavalry or possibly archers on the way themselves, in any event reinforcements, so they opted to leave the Romans for the night. It was also not typical for them to fight at night. Far from being a reprieve for Crassus and his troops, this would turn out to be an even more decisive blow than the arrows had been. He did have a brief moment of courage, and he attempted to rally his men to avenge Publius, but night was soon upon them, and in the darkness, fearing renewed attacks, they could not bury their dead, and the sound of the wounded in agony must have been horrifying, with no ability to treat them effectively. During the early hours, one Roman commander by the name of Ignatius thought of the 300 men under his charge, above the folly of what Crassus had committed them to, and rode off with them, undetected, under the cover of darkness. He would, according to Plutarch, make it to Carrhae, where he would tell the guards in the Roman tongue to let their commander know that there had been a great battle between Crassus and the Parthians. Then, without a word or name given, he rode off with his men towards Zeugma and full escape, although his reputation would be tarnished for desertion of his general. Crassus, however, would soon come to the same conclusion. Finally, realizing staying was hopeless, he left the wounded behind and also, still under the cover of night, made it safely to Carrhae, but not without losing another 4 cohorts to the darkness. The following morning, the Parthians, realizing the Romans had left, slaughtered the remaining wounded Romans and the 4 lost cohorts before arriving at Carrhae and feigning a conference to discuss terms. Crassus, it has been stated, may have been suffering from full PTSD at this point, and chose instead to again attempt to flee under the cover of night with his army to Armenia, but would, over the course of 2 nights, become lost, return to Carrhae, leave again, and become lost yet again. He was also, though, being led by the traitor Andromachus, which essentially made the outcome delayed, but inevitable. He was, however, aided by the Parthians' tradition, as mentioned previously, of not fighting at night, but again, it would be but a temporary reprieve. On that second night, and lost in the marshes, Crassus and the Romans took refuge on a hill, his men chiding him the next day when the Parthians asked for talks and he refused. They were said to have told him he was willing to put their lives into battle with an enemy he lacked the courage to even speak to. Finally, Crassus relented, and he walked down the hill. Who knows what was swirling in his head as he made that march down its slope? Images of the last few days peppered with that of his son as a child and then man? While we don't know the exact terms discussed, we know that Crassus did not leave with his life and was dead. One source says the Parthians asked for a withdrawal and abandonment of all territory east of the Euphrates. Crassus had so brashly crossed, but that he feared ability to make that decision. General Surena approached the hill, and he shouted to the remaining Romans that while Crassus had met with his just deserts, the rest could come down without fear. Those Romans who tried again to flee were cut to pieces, but the ones who agreed were spared. With his death, the Roman triumvirate disintegrated, and soon Pompey and Caesar would be at odds, but for the Parthians, it was a reprieve. The loss would go down for the Romans as among the worst, with the likes of Cana and Adrianople. The future battles between the two powers were as between perfect foils. The Parthians were mobile and extremely defensive with many capitals, but not familiar with siege weapon technology and therefore did not do that well with holding civilized fortified lands. The Romans, meanwhile, steadfastly stayed true to their ways of fighting rather than the adoption of Parthian techniques that perhaps would have allowed them further pursuits. And so, like an endless game of rock, paper, scissors, the two would never best each other completely. But battle again they would on occasion. Here ends part 5 of the Parthian Empire series. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I enjoyed making it. If you did, please hit like, and if you have enjoyed the content in this channel, but have not yet subscribed, I'd love to have you on board with a subscription. Till the next video, and as always, cheers.